dog that walked out of the tree line that October morning had no collar, no name anyone could call him by, and a scar across his left ear that would turn out to mean more than anyone in that small Georgia county could have guessed. What Wade Calloway didn't know yet, standing on his porch with a cup of burnt coffee going cold in his hand, was that the animal watching him from 30 yards out had once slept beside him in a plywood hooch outside Marja, had once dragged him 11 feet out of a doorway before the second round came through it, and had a name that wasn't Bear, wasn't Duke, wasn't any of the things strangers had called him over the years. His name was Ranger. And 3 years earlier, Wade's own wife had sold him to a man neither of them had ever properly checked out, for $900 and the promise that it would go toward the divorce lawyer. But that morning, Wade didn't know any of that. He just saw a big, scarred-up dog standing at the edge of his property, head low, watching him the way a man watches a door he isn't sure is safe to walk through. Wade Calloway was 38 years old, though most people who met him guessed older. It wasn't just the gray that had come into his beard early, or the way his left knee announced every change in the weather like it had its own barometric pressure system. It was something in the eyes, a stillness that didn't come from calm. It came from a man who had trained himself, over years, to stop reacting to things, because reacting had a cost, and he had already paid enough of it. He lived alone in a single-wide trailer set back off a gravel road outside a town called Cordell, Georgia, population 1,200 and change, the kind of place where the Dollar General was the social hub, and the volunteer fire department still used a hand-cranked siren mounted on a pole by the church. The trailer had come with the 10 acres he'd bought cheap from an estate sale 2 years back when he still had some of the settlement money left, before the roof needed patching and the well pump burned out and the transmission on his truck started slipping in third gear. He'd meant to buy something better eventually. He'd meant to do a lot of things eventually. Inside, the trailer smelled like coffee and gun oil and the particular mustiness of a single man who didn't have anyone reminding him to open a window. There was a couch with one cushion permanently sunk lower than the others, a television that got 4 channels through an antenna bent into a shape that only worked if you didn't touch it, and a corkboard on the wall by the kitchen that still had, pinned in the corner, a photograph curling at the edges. Wade at 26, desert tan and grinning, one arm slung over the back of a dog that stood taller than most men's hips, the two of them squinting into Afghan sunlight like they owned it. He hadn't taken the photo down. He also hadn't looked at it in longer than he wanted to admit. The knee had been shrapnel from a pressure plate IED outside a compound in Helmand Province in the spring of his second deployment, the same blast that had taken the corner of his hearing in the left ear and left a spray of scar tissue across his calf that still itched and humid, weather like tonight's storm had been building all week. The knee had earned him a medical discharge 2 years later, after the surgeries stopped helping, and the Marine Corps decided a man who couldn't run a timed 3-mile wasn't worth carrying on the books anymore, however many times he'd carried other things, other people, mostly, on his own back. The invisible wound was worse, and Wade would have told you that himself, on one of the rare nights he talked about any of it, which mostly happened only with a bottle for company and nobody around to hear him. He didn't sleep so much as he served time in bed, 4 hours here, 90 minutes there, waking at every truck that passed on the county road because some part of his brain that had never gotten the message that the war ended kept running perimeter checks at 3 a.m. He'd learned to live around it, mostly. Coffee instead of real breakfast. Work that used his hands instead of his patience. A private disability rating that had been fought over, appealed, resubmitted, and finally settled at a percentage that covered less than half what the surgeries and the truck payment cost him each month. The VA claim was its own particular betrayal, the bureaucratic kind that didn't announce itself with an explosion, but arrived instead in manila envelopes with government seals on them, denying, deferring, requesting additional documentation for injuries that were, quite literally, written into the metal still sitting in his leg. He had photographs of the blast site. He had the after-action report. He had 2 letters from his old command vouching for the injury. It had taken him 4 years, and a pro bono lawyer working out of a strip mall in Macon to get. The rating he had now, and even that felt like a number some clerk in Atlanta had picked out of the air on a slow Tuesday. The personal betrayal was the one that still had teeth. Renee had married him at 23, back when he was still active duty, and the uniform still meant something to both of them. Back when she used to tell people at church potlucks that her husband trained the smartest dog on the whole East Coast, like it was a fact she was proud to carry around. And for a while, it had been true, and it had been as good as a marriage can be when one half of it disappears for 7, 9, 13 months at a stretch and comes back a slightly different man each time. The dog had been the third member of that household before he was ever anything else, before the marriage soured, before the discharge, before any of it. Ranger designation officially listed as MWD Ranger, tag number M4471, had come into Wade's life during his second enlistment, when the Corps paired him up at Lackland with a 2-year-old Belgian Malinois who'd washed out of one program for being, in the trainer's words, too much dog. Too reactive for bomb work with some handlers, too smart to be bored, which in a working dog often looked the same as being difficult. Wade had taken one look at him in the kennel, ears up, eyes locked, not barking, just watching, weighing Wade the way Wade was used to being weighed by men twice his rank, and had felt something click into place that he didn't have words for at the time and still didn't really, all these years later. They'd deployed together twice. Ranger had a nose that found buried ordnance under 4 inches of packed Afghan clay when the metal detectors came up clean, and more than that, he had something Wade had never seen written up in any manual, a stillness of his own, an ability to read the tension in a room or a village before Wade's own trained eye caught it. Twice, Ranger had planted himself dead in a doorway Wade was about to walk through, refusing to move, refusing to bark, just locking his body like a piece of furniture bolted to the floor, and twice that stubbornness had likely saved men's lives, Wade's included. The dog had gone home with him, eventually, the way working dogs sometimes do when a handler fights for it, paperwork and adoption fees, and a small mountain of forms that Wade had filled out at 2 in the morning between deployments, because some part of him already understood that this animal was not a piece of government equipment, whatever the tag said. Ranger had slept at the foot of their bed for 3 years. He'd been there through Wade's worst nightmares, the kind where Wade woke up swinging before he woke up seeing, and Renee had told him once early on that she used to lie there and watch the dog press his whole weight against Wade's chest until his breathing slowed, like he had a job to do that didn't require a leash or a command. Then came the knee, then came the discharge, then came the 18 months where Wade wasn't easy to live with, where the man Renee had married seemed to recede further every month behind a wall of silence and long drives with no destination, and a temper that flared, briefly and then guiltily, over things that didn't deserve it. He didn't blame her for leaving, not really, not anymore. He blamed her for what she did with the one thing that had never asked anything of him except loyalty. She'd sold Ranger during the divorce, while Wade was 6 weeks into an inpatient program at a VA facility 2 states away, a program he'd checked himself into voluntarily, the one decent decision he credited himself with from that entire stretch of his life. He'd come home to an empty house, a stack of legal papers, and a note that said the dog had gone to a good home, someone with more time, and a check for $450, which was Wade's half of the $900 she said she'd gotten for him. He hadn't cashed the check. It was still somewhere in a drawer, yellowed at the edges now, because cashing it had felt like agreeing to something he had never agreed to. For a long time afterward, he told himself Ranger was better off. That was the story he built and maintained and repeated to himself on the bad nights, because the alternative story, that somewhere out there his dog was living with strangers who didn't know what he'd done, who he'd been, what he needed, was not one Wade could carry alongside everything else he was already carrying. 3 years had passed since then. 3 years of the trailer, the 10 acres, the odd jobs, fence work, engine repair for neighbors who paid him in cash and sometimes in venison, a few months hauling scrap that ended when his knee finally said no more bending under trucks. 3 years of nights that came and went the same shapeless way, until the morning a scarred, gray-muzzled dog walked out of the pines at the edge of his property and stood there, still as a photograph, watching him the way no stray dog Wade had ever seen watched anybody. That morning had started like any other. Wade was up before the sun, the way he always was, sitting on the porch steps with coffee gone lukewarm because he'd forgotten it out there while he checked the water level on his well tank, a chore that had become necessary again after last month's dry spell. The air had that particular October chill Georgia gets right before the leaves start turning, cool enough to see his breath but not yet cold enough for a jacket, and there was a low mist sitting in the hollow between his property and the tree line that made the whole world look like it hadn't quite decided to wake up. He noticed movement before he consciously registered what it was, old training, the kind that never fully turns off, the kind that made him scan tree lines and doorways and roof lines out of habit, even in a place as sleepy as Cordell County. His eyes went to the movement and found the dog standing at the edge of the pines, half in shadow, one paw lifted slightly off the ground like it was deciding whether advancing was worth the risk. He was big, not fat, but broad through the chest in a way that spoke of muscle built for work, not for show. His coat had once probably been a rich sable, but now it was patchy in places, thin along one hip where scar tissue had replaced fur entirely, and his muzzle had gone almost entirely gray. One ear stood up sharp and alert. The other was notched near the tip, an old wound long healed over. His left eye had a faint clouding to it, a cataract starting, maybe, or the aftermath of some old injury never treated properly. He held himself with a stillness that Wade recognized on some level before he let himself think about why. "Well," Wade said out loud, mostly to himself, setting the coffee mug down on the step beside him, "you're a rough-looking customer." The dog didn't move, didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't do any of the things a stray usually did when it found itself sized up by a stranger on a porch. It just watched him, ears tracking his voice, weight settled low and even across all four legs. Wade had grown up around dogs his whole life and had spent 4 years of his military career working with one particular animal who taught him more about reading a dog's intentions than any trainer ever had. He knew, looking at this one, that whatever had happened to this animal, it hadn't been raised in somebody's backyard chasing squirrels. There was a discipline to the way he held his body, a patience. "You hungry?" Wade asked, more out of habit than expectation of an answer. He went inside, moving slow and unhurried, the way you approach any wild or wary thing when you don't want to spook it, and came back out with a plate of leftover chicken from the night before, more than he'd normally have wasted on a stray, but something about the dog's ribs, visible even under the matted fur, made the decision for him. He set the plate down at the bottom of the porch steps, backed off, and sat back down. It took almost 10 minutes. Wade didn't rush it, didn't call out, didn't do anything except sit there sipping coffee that had gone properly cold now, watching out of the corner of his eye while the dog closed the distance one careful step at a time, stopping every few feet to reassess, the way an animal does when it's been burned before by trusting the wrong hand. When he finally reached the plate, he didn't wolf the food down the way a truly starving stray would have. He ate with a strange, deliberate control, glancing up at Wade between bites, like some part of him was still waiting for a command to release him from a sit. That detail lodged itself in Wade's chest like a splinter he couldn't quite locate to pull out. He didn't let himself follow the thought any further that morning. He told himself it was nothing. Dogs that had been abused sometimes ate careful like that, waiting for the hand that fed them to turn into the hand that hit them. It didn't have to mean anything more than a hard life. "All right," Wade said, when the plate was licked clean and the dog had backed off a respectful 5 feet and sat, unprompted, watching him again. "You can stick around a night if you want. Won't cost you nothing but manners." The dog's tail moved once, a slow single sweep against the dirt, and then stilled, like even that small display of feeling was something he'd learned to ration. Wade told himself that first night that he wasn't getting attached. He set an old horse blanket down in the shed, left the door propped, put out water, and went inside to his own restless 4 hours of sleep. And if some part of him lay awake a little longer than usual listening for the dog's movements outside, he chalked that up to the same watchfulness that kept him up most nights anyway. By the third day, the dog had a name, because Wade found he couldn't keep calling him the dog in his own head without it feeling wrong, disres. Pectful somehow, like refusing to properly introduce yourself to someone you were going to be spending real time with. He didn't put much thought into it. He just found himself saying "bear" one morning, on account of the dog's size and the low rumbling sound he made instead of a bark, and it stuck without either of them seeming to mind. "You look like hell, Bear," Wade told him on that third morning, crouched at a careful distance while the dog lay in a patch of thin sunlight by the shed, watching him with that same steady, assessing gaze. "Somebody let you go through some things." The dog's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but he didn't move, didn't come closer, held his distance the way he'd held it since the first morning, close enough to accept food and water and the occasional low conversation, not close enough to be touched. Wade didn't push it. He understood something about not being pushed. He drove into Cordell that afternoon to buy real dog food, the good stuff, not the discount brand, and a proper leash and collar even though the dog didn't seem inclined to wander far. And while he was standing in the aisle at the feed store debating between two brands he didn't actually know anything about, a woman behind the register, Dot Meacham, who'd run that store for as long as Wade had been alive, practically, asked him if he'd finally got himself a dog. "Something like that," Wade said. "Showed up on my land a few days back. Rough shape. Big fella, sable-colored, one ear notched up." Wade looked up from the shelf. "You seen him?" "Seen him wandering the county for going on a week now, I'd guess," Dot said, ringing up his purchase without much urgency, the way people talked in Cordell, like time was a resource nobody was worried about running out of. Cletus Handy said he saw a dog matching that description out past the old Prout Kennel property, maybe 10 days back. Wouldn't come near him either. Skittish thing. Prout Kennel, Wade repeated. The name meant nothing to him yet. It would, eventually. But that afternoon it was just a name, filed away without weight. Dale Prout's old operation, out on Route 9, used to breed and sell working dogs, German shepherds mostly, some Malinois. Man had a reputation for cutting corners, if you know what I mean. Ain't run much of anything out there in a couple years, not since the county started looking into some of his paperwork, but he's still out there. You want my advice, you keep that dog close and don't go asking Prout any questions about where he came from. Man's got a temper on him. Wade thanked her, paid for the dog food, and drove home turning the name over in his mind without quite knowing why it snagged on something, the way a word you almost recognize sits at the edge of your tongue. By the end of the first week, Bear had moved from the shed to the porch, curling up on the boards a few feet from Wade's chair each evening, close enough now that Wade could reach down and rest a hand on his flank without the dog flinching away, though he still watched that hand descend every single time, like he needed to see it coming. Wade started talking to him the way a man alone talks to an animal when there's nobody else around to hear how much he says out loud. He told Bear about the knee, about the coffee going cold on the porch steps most mornings because he forgot it was there, about the fence he needed to mend on the east side of the property before winter. He didn't tell him about Renee, not at first. Some things took longer to say out loud, even to a dog who couldn't repeat them to anybody. "You've got a limp too," Wade observed one evening, watching Bear settle down onto the porch boards with the particular careful stiffness of an animal favoring an old injury. "Right rear. Somebody hurt you bad once, didn't they?" Bear looked up at him at the sound of his voice, held his gaze for a long moment, and then set his head down on his paws with a low sigh that seemed to carry more weight than a sigh from a stray dog had any right to carry. It was on the 9th day, while Wade was running a brush through Bear's matted coat, a task the dog had finally allowed, standing stiff and tolerant rather than relaxed, but allowing it nonetheless, that Wade's fingers caught on something in the fur just behind the notched ear. He parted the coat carefully, expecting a burr or a tick, and found instead a patch of skin where the fur had never fully grown back over old scar tissue, and tattooed into that scar tissue, faded but legible if you knew what you were looking at, was a string of characters. A letter, 4 numbers, another letter. Wade's hand went still. He'd seen tattoos like that before. He'd had a dog with a tattoo like that before. "No," he said out loud, quiet, more breath than voice. "No, that ain't." He parted the fur further with hands that had gone unsteady in a way they hadn't been in years, not since the blast, not since the surgeries, and he found the rest of it, faint but there, M4471. Wade sat back on his heels in the dirt of his own yard and stared at the dog in front of him like he was looking at a ghost, because in every practical sense, that's exactly what he was. "Ranger," he said, and his voice broke clean in half on the second syllable. The dog's head came up sharply at the sound of his own name, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years, and something in his posture changed entirely. The wariness didn't vanish, not completely. 3 years of whatever he'd endured didn't undo itself in a single moment. But his ears came fully forward, his whole body leaned toward Wade with an intensity that hadn't been there a second before, and he made a sound Wade remembered with a jolt that went through his chest like current, not a bark. Not a whine, but a low, rolling half-groan, half-moan, a sound Ranger used to make exactly once, years ago, whenever Wade came home from a long day and the dog couldn't decide whether to be dignified about his happiness or just let it out. "Ranger," Wade said again, and this time when he reached out, the dog closed the last of the distance between them himself, pressing his full weight into Wade's chest the exact way he used to, the exact way Renee had once described watching him do on Wade's worst nights, and Wade Calloway, 38 years old, decorated, discharged, divorced, and dry-eyed through more hard things than most men see in a lifetime. sat in the dirt of his own front yard, and wept like something in him had finally been given permission to break. He didn't know how long they stayed like that, long enough that his knee complained bitterly about the position by the time he finally moved, long enough that the light had shifted and gone gold and low across the yard. Ranger didn't pull away once. He stayed pressed against Wade's chest, that low sound rumbling on and off in his throat, and when Wade finally pulled back to look at him, really look at him, he saw past the gray muzzle and the clouded eye and the notched ear to the dog underneath all of it, the one who used to sleep at the foot of his and Renee's bed, the one who'd planted himself in a doorway in Marja and refused to budge until Wade understood why. "Where the hell have you been?" Wade said, not really a question, more a statement of everything he didn't understand yet and desperately needed to. "What did they do to you?" Ranger, of course, couldn't answer, but something in the way he leaned harder into Wade's hands, the way his whole body seemed to finally exhale after what might have been years of holding tension, told Wade that whatever the answer was, it wasn't a good one. Wade didn't sleep that night, not that this was unusual for him, but this particular sleeplessness had a different texture to it, not the old vigilance of a man listening for danger, but something closer to disbelief that needed guarding against. Like if he closed his eyes too long, the dog might turn out to have been a dream, and he'd wake to find the porch empty again. He sat up most of the night with his back against the headboard, and Ranger stretched along the floor beside the bed, in the exact spot the dog used to claim years before, like the intervening years had never happened, like the muscle memory of the place itself had called him back to it. In the morning, Wade made 2 calls. The first was to the county records office, a call that got him nowhere useful beyond confirming that yes, a kennel operation under the name Prout had been licensed in the county for several years before that license lapsed, and no, they couldn't discuss specific animal transactions over the phone, and if he had concerns, he should file a report with animal control. The second call was the one that mattered. Wade still had the number for Gunnery Sergeant Frank Aliotta saved in his phone, though he hadn't used it in over 2 years, not since a stiff, awkward call around the time of the divorce where neither of them had known quite what to say to the other beyond the basics. Aliotta had been the kennel master at Wade's last duty station, the man who ran the entire K-9 program administratively, who kept the records that mattered, chip numbers, deployment histories, adoption paperwork, everything. Aliotta picked up on the 4th ring, his voice gruff with the particular flatness of a man who answered unknown numbers expecting telemarketers. "Frank, it's Wade Calloway." There was a pause, then something that might have been surprise softening the gruffness. "Calloway, damn, it's been a minute, you all right?" "I need you to pull a record for me," Wade said, skipping past the pleasantries in a way that would have felt rude in any other conversation, but felt in this one like the only acceptable use of the time. "MWD Ranger, tag M4471. I need his adoption file, whatever's on record for where he went after." Another pause, longer this time. "Why you asking about that now?" thought TH. "That dog got adopted out private, years back. Your ex-wife handled it, didn't she?" "She did." Wade's jaw was tight enough that the words came out clipped. "He's on my porch right now, Frank. Showed up out of the woods 9 days ago. He's in bad shape." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Wade thought the call had dropped. "You're sure it's him?" Aliotta finally said, careful, the voice of a man who'd seen enough grief and hope tangled together in his line of work to know not to get ahead of the facts. Tattoos still legible behind his left ear. M4471. "I'd know that dog anywhere, Frank, tattoo or not, but I checked it twice." "Give me a day," Aliotta said. "I'll pull what I can. Some of it's gonna be old paper records, might take some digging, but I'll pull it." It took him 2 days, not one, and during those 2 days Wade found himself watching Ranger with a kind of hyper-attentiveness that mirrored, almost exactly, the hypervigilance the dog himself displayed toward every sound, every shadow, every unfamiliar movement at the edge of the property. They were 2 animals cut from similar cloth, Wade thought more than once during those days, both of them jumping at things a normal creature wouldn't blink at, both of them carrying wounds that didn't show up on any X-ray. When Aliotta called back, his voice had a different weight to it, careful in a way that told Wade before the words did that whatever was coming wasn't going to sit easy. "All right," Aliotta said. "I got the file. It ain't complete, some of this is secondhand, pulled from a few different sources, but here's what I got confirmed. Your ex-wife's paperwork lists the adopter as a private buyer, name of Dale Prout, out of your neck of the woods, actually Cordell, Georgia. $900, cash transaction, no formal adoption agency involved, which, Wade, I gotta say, that's not how it's supposed to work. A retired MWD is supposed to go through a proper adoption process, background check, home visit, the whole 9 yards. Somebody skipped every part of that. Prout, Wade said, and the name that had meant nothing to him 9 days earlier suddenly meant everything, because he'd heard it already from Dot Meacham at the feed store, attached to a kennel operation that had a reputation for cutting corners and a temper nobody wanted to test. You know him. I know of him. He's got property out past Route 9, not 15 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. Well, here's the part you're not gonna like, Aliata continued. I made a couple calls to some old contacts who track breeding and working dog sales, guys who keep an eye on this stuff because there's a whole gray market out there for dogs with military or police pedigree, sells for a premium, especially with buyers who want a dog with real bite work training, but don't want to go through the legitimate channels, don't want the oversight that comes with buying from an approved program. One of my contacts recognized the name Prout immediately, said there's been chatter for a couple years about a kennel in Georgia buying up retired and washed-out working dogs cheap, off owners who don't know what they're really worth, and reselling them at a heavy markup to buyers who want the prestige, without asking too many questions about paperwork. Wade sat down slowly on the porch steps, Ranger's head coming up immediately at the change in his posture, watching him with that same steady attention. You're telling me my dog got sold into some kind of black market operation? I'm telling you it looks that way, yeah, and Wade, there's more. My contact said Prout's had at least 2 animal cruelty complaints filed against him over the years, both dismissed for lack of evidence, both involving dogs that came out of his kennel in rough shape or didn't come out at all. Nothing ever stuck. County's a small place, Wade, you know how that goes, man's got friends, or at least people who don't want the trouble of crossing him. Wade looked down at Ranger, at the notched ear and the clouded eye and the patches where fur had never regrown over old scars, and felt something cold and steady settle into his chest, the particular calm that used to come over him right before a mission, the kind of calm that wasn't the absence of anger, but the channeling of it into something useful. Send me whatever paperwork you've got, Wade said. Everything, I want it all. I'll email it today. Wade, you take this to the sheriff, all right. Whatever you're thinking about doing yourself, take it through proper channels first. You've got documentation now. Chips registered, tattoos confirmed, adoption trail leads straight to Prout. Let the law do its job. I hear you, Frank, Wade said, and meant it mostly. Thanks. He hung up and sat there a long while with his hand resting on Ranger's back, feeling the dog's steady breathing, the particular warmth of him, and thought about all the versions of the last tea. 3 years that might have happened to this animal in between the day Renee handed him off for $900 and the day he walked, half-starved and scarred, out of the tree line onto Wade's property. He thought about what kind of operation kept working dogs in conditions bad enough to leave that many marks. He thought about the fact that Ranger had traveled, however far Prout's property was from here. The dog had found his way, on an injured leg, through unfamiliar country, to a man he hadn't seen in 3 years, in a place he'd never even lived. How'd you find me? Wade said quietly, more to himself than to the dog, though Ranger's ears turned toward the sound of his voice anyway. You shouldn't even know where I live. He didn't have an answer for that, and he suspected he never fully would. Some things about a dog's loyalty didn't reduce down to a logical explanation. He just knew, looking at Ranger now, that whatever had happened at that kennel had been bad enough that the dog had risked everything, an unfamiliar landscape, hunger, exposure, whatever predators or dangers existed between there and here, rather than stay another day. That afternoon, instead of driving straight to the sheriff's office, which some part of him knew was the responsible thing to do and fully intended to do, Wade found himself steering his truck slowly past the old Prout property on Route 9, not stopping, not even slowing more than the curve in the road required, just looking. The kennel operation from the road looked exactly like the kind of place that would earn a reputation for cutting corners. A cluster of low cinderblock buildings, chain-link runs with gaps in the fencing patched crudely with baling wire, a farmhouse set back from the road with paint peeling off the clapboard siding, a couple of trucks parked haphazardly in a dirt yard littered with rusted equipment. There were dogs visible in some of the runs, barking at nothing in particular the way kenneled dogs do, and Wade's trained eye, the same eye that used to scan compounds for signs of what was really going on inside, clocked details that a casual passerby would miss. The runs were undersized for the number of dogs in some of them. The water troughs, from what he could see, looked low. There was a man standing near one of the cinder-block buildings, heavyset, wearing a stained undershirt despite the October chill, watching Wade's truck pass with an expression that wasn't friendly. Wade kept driving, didn't make eye contact longer than a casual glance would suggest, and didn't come back that day, but he'd seen enough to feel the cold, steady thing in his chest settle deeper. The bonding montage of those following weeks, though Wade wouldn't have called it that, wouldn't have called it anything except the slow, unglamorous business of two damaged creatures learning to trust each other again, became the real center of gravity in his days. He restructured his whole routine around Ranger without quite deciding to. He woke earlier, because Ranger woke at first light and paced the length of the porch until Wade came out. He started cooking real meals again, actual food instead of whatever came fastest out of a can, partly because Ranger needed proper nutrition to put weight back on his ribs, and partly because feeding another creature turned out to be a different experience than feeding just yourself, one that made the effort feel worth something. He took Ranger to the vet in the second week, a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who ran a small practice out of a converted farmhouse 20 minutes toward town, and she confirmed what Wade had already suspected. The right rear leg showed evidence of an old fracture that had healed without proper setting, likely a year or more prior, leaving the joint slightly misaligned and prone to arthritis that would only worsen with age. The clouded eye was indeed an early cataract, possibly related to an old injury, possibly just age catching up with a dog who Aliata's paperwork put at 9 years old now, which in a large working breed was well into a dog's senior years. There were old scars consistent, Dr. Anand said carefully, choosing her words the way medical professionals do when they suspect something worse than they're willing to say outright, with either fighting or physical punishment, though she couldn't say for certain which. Wade drove home from that appointment with his hands tight on the steering wheel and didn't say much of anything until they pulled back onto his own gravel road, at which point he reached over without looking and rested his hand on Ranger's head, and the dog leaned into it, the way he'd been leaning into more and more contact each day, a little more trust extended every time it wasn't punished. There was a particular quirk Wade noticed developing, or maybe renoticing, because some small voice in the back of his mind told him this had always been part of who Ranger was, buried under tea. 3 years of trauma and only now resurfacing. Whenever Wade came back inside after being outside for more than a few minutes, checking the fence line, working on the truck, anything that took him briefly out of the dog's sight, Ranger would let out that same low, rolling half-groan he'd made the day of the tattoo discovery, a sound that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a bark, a sound entirely his own, and it became, over those weeks, the sound Wade found himself listening for without realizing he was doing it. The way you listen for a particular voice in a crowded room. "There he is," Wade would say, every time, like it was a ritual neither of them had agreed to out loud, but both of them observed anyway. "There's my boy." The physical care mattered as much as anything in those weeks. Wade cleaned a deep, half-healed wound on Ranger's hip that had scabbed over improperly, likely from repeated re-injury against something sharp in whatever enclosure he'd been kept in, and the process took 3 separate sessions before Ranger would allow it without flinching hard enough to pull away, Wade working slow, talking low and steady the entire time, the same tone of voice he used to use calming young Marines through their first firefight, a voice built for making frightened creatures believe, even briefly, that someone competent was in control of the situation. "I know," Wade murmured, dabbing carefully at the wound with a saline solution the vet had provided, Ranger's whole body rigid beneath his hands. "I know it stings. Almost done. You did this for me plenty of times, buddy. Way I remember it, this makes us square." He was talking, of course, about a night in Marja that he hadn't spoken about out loud to another living soul in years, a night when a piece of shrapnel had opened his calf to the bone, and Ranger had stayed pressed against his good leg the entire helicopter ride out, not moving, not whining, just present, the way only a dog who understood exactly what was needed could be present. There was a panic response, too, the first time a truck backfired on the county road while Ranger was out in the yard, a sharp, sudden crack of sound that sent the dog into an immediate, full-body flinch, ears flat, tail tucked, a scramble toward the shed that had none of his usual careful dignity in it, just raw animal terror. Wade had followed him, slow and unhurried despite his own instinct, the blast-adjacent part of his brain screaming at a similar volume, and had sat down on the ground outside the shed door, not reaching in, not calling, just present and quiet, the way he'd learned, through years of his own therapy sessions and one particularly patient counselor at the VA, that presence itself could be a kind of medicine when panic had a person, or an animal, in its grip. It took almost 20 minutes before Ranger's breathing evened out enough that he crept back out of the shed on his own, low to the ground, and pressed himself against Wade's side without prompting. "Yeah," Wade said quietly, arms settling around the dog's shoulders. "I know exactly how that feels. World doesn't always understand it's not actually happening again. Takes your body a while to catch up with your head." He didn't say the rest of what he was thinking, which was that he recognized, with an uncomfortable clarity, that he was describing his own condition as much as the dog's. Some nights that fall, lying awake in the dark with Ranger's steady breathing audible from the floor beside the bed, Wade found himself wondering which one of them was actually taking care of the other, and deciding, eventually, that the question didn't matter as much as the fact that it was happening at all. By late October, 6 weeks or so after Ranger had first appeared, the dog had put back nearly all the weight he needed. His coat had started to fill back in patchy but improving, and he moved around the property with something approaching his old confidence, still favoring the bad leg, still flinching at sudden sounds, but present in a way that felt fundamentally different from the wary, half-feral creature who'd first watched Wade from the tree line. It was during that stretch of relative calm that things started to go wrong. It began small, the way these things usually do. Wade noticed it first on a Tuesday evening, coming back from a supply run into town for fence wire, when Ranger, who normally greeted his return with that low groaning sound and an eager press against his legs, instead planted himself rigid at the edge of the yard, nose pointed toward the tree line at the eastern edge of Wade's property, body locked in a stillness that Wade recognized instantly, a stillness he hadn't seen the dog display since Afghanistan. It wasn't a bark. Ranger didn't bark much at all, Wade had noticed, which fit with everything Aliotta's records confirmed about his specialized training. A dog trained for detection and clearing work was often trained specifica. Ellie not to bark, not to give away a position, but instead to alert through posture, a fixed stare, a raised paw, a total stillness that communicated danger to a handler who knew how to read it. Wade set the fence wire down without a sound and followed Ranger's line of sight, scanning the tree line the way he'd scanned 1,000 tree lines before, and saw nothing obvious, just shadow and pine, and the ordinary texture of dusk settling over rural Georgia. But Ranger held his position for a full 2 minutes, unmoving, before finally relaxing, and Wade filed the moment away with the particular unease of a man who trusted his dog's instincts more than his own eyes. It happened again 3 nights later, this time closer to the house, Ranger going rigid at the porch steps around midnight, staring toward the gravel drive with an intensity that pulled Wade fully out of a half-sleep and onto his feet before he'd even consciously decided to move. He grabbed the old maglite from beside the door, heavy enough to double as a weapon if it came to that, a habit he'd never quite shaken, and stepped out onto the porch beside the dog, following his gaze down the length of the drive toward the road. Nothing, no headlights, no sound of an engine, no obvious presence. But when Wade walked the drive the next morning in full daylight, he found tire tracks in the soft shoulder near his mailbox that hadn't been there the day before, tracks from a vehicle that had pulled off the road, sat idling long enough to leave a visible depression, and then continued on. He didn't mention it to anyone at first, not even Aliotta, mostly because he didn't have anything concrete enough yet to sound like more than an anxious man reading meaning into nothing. But the pattern continued through the following week, Ranger alerting, always toward the same general direction, always at night, always with that same rigid, silent focus that Wade's gut told him meant something real. The break came on a Thursday, when Wade drove into Cordell for groceries and stopped on impulse at the sheriff's substation, a small brick building that shared a parking lot with the post office and was staffed most days by a deputy named Cal Whitfield, a man Wade knew slightly from the feed store and from a few community events he'd attended in his early days in the county, back when he'd still been trying to build something like a social life. "Cal," Wade said, finding him behind the front counter doing paperwork, "you got a minute?" Whitfield looked up, recognized him, and waved him back toward a chair beside the desk. "Calloway, heard you got yourself a dog. big fella showed up out of nowhere. News traveled fast in a place this size. Wade wasn't surprised. That's part of what I wanted to talk to you about, actually. He laid it out carefully, methodically, the way he'd been trained to brief a report: the tattoo, the confirmation from Aliata, the paper trail leading to Dale Prute's kennel, the 2 dismissed cruelty complaints Aliata's contact had mentioned, and finally the recent nighttime activity near his property. The vehicle he suspected had been watching the place. Whitfield's expression shifted through the telling, from casual interest to something more focused, more careful. You got documentation on the dog's identity, the tattoo, the chip number, all of it. Emailed to me by the kennel master who processed his original service record. I can forward it to you. Do that? Whitfield leaned back in his chair, rubbing at his jaw. I'll be straight with you, Wade. Prute's a name that comes up around here more than the county'd like. We've had complaints before. Animal Control's been out to his property twice that I know of, found conditions that weren't great but weren't quite bad enough to meet the legal threshold for seizure, not with the way our county ordinance is written. Man's slippery about it, keeps just enough dogs in just good enough shape that a surface inspection doesn't turn up much. And the vehicle near my place. Can't do much with tire tracks and a feeling, not officially, but if you're seeing this pattern, and if it connects to a dog that came out of his operation and clearly didn't come out of it by choice. Whitfield paused, weighing something. You said he was near starved when he showed up. Old fracture that never got set right, scarring consistent with abuse. That's the kind of specific, documented evidence that could actually move a case forward if we can tie it directly to Prute's custody of the animal. I want that paperwork, and Wade, if you see that vehicle again, you call it an immediate, you don't go handle it yourself. You understand me? Man's got a temper, and from what you're describing, it sounds like he might have a reason to be nervous about a dog that got away from him showing back up with a paper trail attached. Wade drove home that afternoon with the cold, steady thing in his chest settled even deeper, and that night, for the first time since Ranger had arrived, he brought his old sidearm in from the truck's lockbox and set it, loaded, on the nightstand within easy reach. The investigation, once it had a name and a direction, moved with the particular patience Wade had learned in the military, not the patience of a man waiting passively, but the patience of a man methodically closing every gap an enemy might exploit. He forwarded Aliata's paperwork to Whitfield the same evening, and over the following days, pieces began falling into a shape that made Wade's jaw tighten every time a new one surfaced. Whitfield called him 4 days later, asking him to come by the substation, and this time his tone had lost the casual edge entirely. We pulled some records, Whitfield said, once Wade was settled in the chair beside his desk. County business filings, some financial documents Animal Control had on hand from a prior investigation that never went anywhere. Prute's kennel operation, officially it's licensed as a working dog breeding and training facility. Unofficially, best we can piece together, it's been operating for the last several years as something closer to a laundering point for dogs with military or police pedigree that come from questionable sources. Retired working dogs, sold cheap by owners who don't fully understand what they're worth or don't have the resources to keep them properly, get resold at a heavy markup to private buyers who want the prestige and the training without going through legitimate channels. Sometimes those dogs get held in poor conditions for months while Prute lines up a buyer willing to pay premium. Sometimes, if a dog doesn't sell quick enough or turns out harder to handle than advertised. Whitfield didn't finish the sentence, and he didn't need to. You said this connects to my dog. How exactly? Wade said, though some part of him had already assembled the shape of it and just needed to hear it confirmed. Your ex-wife's sale paperwork lists Prute as the buyer directly, $900, no adoption agency, no home visit, exactly the kind of under-the-table transaction his whole operation runs on. We think, and I want to stress, this part's still coming together, we think Ranger got held at that kennel for some period after the purchase, likely mistreated in a manner consistent with what your vet documented, and either escaped or was let loose, possibly because he wasn't cooperating with whatever training or resale plan Prute had for him, possibly because he was deemed too much trouble. Wade sat with that for a long moment, feeling the old fracture in his own composure straining against something that wanted very badly to come out sideways. There's one more piece, Whitfield added, watching Wade's face carefully. Might be nothing, might be something. Your ex-wife's current husband, man named Ray Duquette, he's got a business relationship with Prute. co-signed a loan for some kennel equipment a couple years back, according to county filing records. Doesn't prove anything about the original sale being anything other than what it looked like on paper, but it does mean the connection between your household and Prout's operation runs a little deeper than a random transaction. Wade absorbed that with the particular stillness he'd trained into himself years ago, the stillness that let him process bad information without letting it show on his face, though inside, something that had been simmering quietly for weeks came dangerously close to a boil. Renee's new husband, doing business with the man whose kennel had apparently starved and broken his dog's leg, and left him scarred enough that a vet's trained eye read abuse in the marks. It didn't necessarily mean Renee had known what kind of place she was sending Ranger to. Wade wanted, for reasons he didn't fully examine, to believe she hadn't known, that this was carelessness rather than cruelty. But the connection sat there regardless, an ugly thread tying his old life to his new one. "What happens now?" Wade asked. "Now we build the case properly. I want you to keep documenting anything you observe near your property, vehicles, timing, anything. Animal Control's going to do another welfare check on Prout's kennel, this time with your vet's documentation on file, and a direct paper trail connecting a specific animal to specific conditions. That's stronger ground than we've had before. And I'm going to have a car do a few extra passes on the county road near your place over the next couple weeks, just as a deterrent." It wasn't enough not for the part of Wade that had spent years learning to solve problems directly, but it was proper, it was the right way to do it, and he told himself that as he drove home, Ranger's presence in the passenger seat, a habit the dog had developed over recent weeks, riding along on every errand like he couldn't stand to let Wade out of his sight for longer than necessary, a steadying W. Ate beside him. The confrontation, when it came, arrived on a night in early November, cold enough now that Wade had started a fire in the trailer's small wood stove, cold enough that his breath fogged when he stepped out onto the porch around 11 to check on a strange sound he'd half heard from inside. Ranger was already up, already rigid, already staring toward the tree line at the eastern edge of the property, with that fixed, silent alertness Wade had come to trust completely. Wade didn't turn on the porch light. Old habit, light behind you made you a silhouette, an easy target, and some part of his brain had never stopped operating on that assumption even here, even now. He crouched low beside Ranger, one hand resting on the dog's back, feeling the tension coiled through the animal's whole body, and listened. There it was, the low crunch of gravel under careful footsteps, someone moving along the edge of his drive trying, not quite successfully, to move quietly, and a second set of footsteps behind the first, heavier, less careful. Wade's mind went, without any conscious decision to send it there, into the particular clarity that had once kept him alive through firefights and IED sweeps, and every other kind of controlled chaos the Corps had trained into him. His heart rate didn't spike so much as it steadied, breathing slowing into the deliberate rhythm he'd been taught, thoughts narrowing to exactly what mattered and discarding everything that didn't. He went back inside without a sound, retrieved the sidearm from the nightstand, and checked his phone, one bar of signal enough, he hoped, to get a call out if it came to that. He texted Whitfield's cell, the number the deputy had given him for exactly this kind of situation, 4 words, "Possible intruders, my property," and then he moved back to the door, easing it open just enough to slip through without the hinge announcing him. Ranger pressed silent against his leg the entire way, moving with the same trained economy of motion Wade himself was using. The two figures had made it to the edge of the yard by the time Wade got eyes on them again, moving toward the shed rather than the house, which told him something useful, that whatever they were after wasn't a confrontation with him directly, at least not as the primary objective. One of them carried something long and awkward-shaped, wrapped in a tarp, that Wade's trained eye read immediately as a weapon of some kind, though he couldn't tell yet if it was a firearm or something else. He didn't call out a warning. Years of training had stripped that instinct out of him entirely. You didn't announce yourself to an unknown threat and give it the advantage of surprise. Instead, he moved along the tree line himself, staying low, using the shed's shadow and the uneven ground to close distance quietly, Ranger moving with him in a silent, low-slung gait that Wade recognized with a jolt as textbook tactical movement, the kind of thing you couldn't teach a dog in 6 weeks, the kind of thing that lived deep in years of specialized training that had never fully left him. He got close enough to hear voices, low and irritated. Said the dog wouldn't be here, said it probably died out there weeks ago. Don't care what he said. I'm not doing this again. This whole thing's a liability. We should have just. The second voice cut off sharp when Ranger, without any command from Wade, without any warning at all, broke from his silent stalking position and closed the remaining distance in a low, fast charge, not barking, not growling until the very last second, moving with a speed and precision that spoke to exactly the kind of apprehension training a specialized working dog carries even years removed from active duty, and hit the nearer figure high on the shoulder, driving him hard into the dirt with a controlled, professional bite that locked and held rather than tearing wildly, exactly the way a properly trained MWD was built to subdue rather than maim. The man screamed, more from shock than pain in that first instant, and the second figure spun toward the sound, bringing up the tarp-wrapped object in a motion Wade read instantly as a threat, and Wade closed the last 15 feet at a dead sprint, knee screaming its protest the entire way, and drove his shoulder into the second man before the tarp fully cleared whatever was underneath it, taking them both down hard into the cold dirt, Wade's training taking over completely now. Pinning the arm holding the weapon against the ground, with a controlled, economical hold that had put down men twice this one's size back, when Wade's body had been younger and less broken. "Sheriff's on the way," Wade said, low and even, his voice carrying none of the adrenaline screaming through his own system, a discipline he'd built over years of exactly these moments. "You so much as breathe wrong, this gets a lot worse for you." The man beneath him, heavyset, breathing hard, smell ing of sweat and something chemical, cheap cologne maybe, or motor oil, went still, the fight going out of him the way it does in men who talk themselves into violence they don't actually have the stomach to see through. Ranger held his position on the first man, bite locked but controlled, not thrashing, not escalating beyond what was needed to keep the threat contained, exactly the discipline his training had built into him years before any of this happened, discipline that 3 years of neglect and abuse hadn't managed to erase entirely. The deputies arrived 9 minutes later, Whitfield himself, along with a second unit, headlights sweeping across the yard, and Wade called Ranger off with a single low command. "Out," a word he hadn't used in years but that some part of him had never forgotten, and the dog released immediately, backing off to a controlled sit beside Wade, chest heaving but composed, watching the scene with the same steady attention he'd shown from the very first morning he walked out of the tree line. The two men, once cuffed and searched under the harsh wash of Whitfield's flashlight, turned out to be Dale Prout himself, the heavyset man Wade had glimpsed from the road weeks earlier, and a younger man later identified as one of Prout's kennel hands, and the tarp-wrapped object turned out not to be a firearm but a heavy pry bar and a set of bolt cutters, tools better suited to breaking into a shed or a vehicle than to a straightforward assault, which told Wade. Once his own adrenaline had ebbed enough to think clearly that whatever the two men had come for that night, it hadn't originally been him. It had been the dog, a witness, a walking piece of evidence, a loose end that had wandered somewhere Prout clearly hadn't expected him to survive long enough to become documented, chipped, and connected to an active investigation. Prout, sitting handcuffed in the dirt with a torn shoulder, and a face gone pale with the particular fear of a man who'd finally run out of room to maneuver, didn't say much that night beyond demanding a lawyer, but the pry bar and bolt cutters, combined with the timing, combined with the pattern of nighttime surveillance Wade had documented for weeks, gave Whitfield more than enough to hold both men for attempted burglary and trespassing, while the broader investigation into the kennel operation moved forward. It took another 6 weeks for the full case to build out, weeks during which Animal Control finally executed a proper seizure warrant on Prout's property, backed by the documentation from Wade's vet and the direct chain of evidence tying a specific, identifiable animal to conditions consistent with neglect and abuse. They found 14 dogs on the property in various states of poor care, several with injuries left untreated, and financial records that, once subpoenaed, revealed a pattern going back nearly 4 years of exactly the kind of under-the-table resale operation Whitfield had described, retired and washed-out working dogs bought cheap from unsuspecting or desperate owners, held in substandard conditions, and resold at significant markup to buyers across 3 states who wanted the cachet of a military or police pedigree without the oversight a legitimate adoption process required. Renee's involvement, when Wade finally learned the full shape of it during a phone call with Whitfield that he dreaded and put off for as long as he reasonably could, turned out to be closer to carelessness than complicity. She'd been introduced to Prout through Ray Duquette, sold the dog quickly during a financially and emotionally difficult stretch of the divorce, without doing any real due diligence on where he was headed, and by her own statement to investigators. Hadn't known the conditions Ranger had endured until the case became public. Wade didn't know how much of that to believe, and some part of him suspected he'd never fully resolved that question in his own mind, but he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't have the appetite to pursue it further. Whatever anger he'd carried about the sale itself had, over the preceding weeks, transformed into something quieter, something more focused on the animal recovering on his porch than on relitigating a marriage that was already over. Ray Duquette's business relationship with Prout drew more serious scrutiny. The loan co-signature, combined with several other financial ties investigators uncovered, suggested a level of involvement in the broader operation that went well beyond an innocent kennel equipment purchase. And though Wade didn't follow every detail of the case as it moved through the county and eventually state prosecutors' hands over the following months, he understood, from what Whitfield told him in periodic updates, that Duquette was facing his own set of charges connected to the financial side of the operation, separate from whatever legal troubles existed between him and Renee's H. Wooshold. Prout himself facing charges for animal cruelty, illegal sale of government property, since technically a retired MWD's transfer was supposed to go through official channels that his purchase had circumvented, and now attempted burglary and trespassing connected to the incident on Wade's property, took a plea deal roughly 4 months after that November night, one that kept him out of a courtroom trial, but put him behind bars for a stretch long enough that Whitfield, delivering the news over coffee at the diner in town, seemed genuinely satisfied with the outcome, and told Wade plainly that without his documentation, without Ranger's tattoo and chip number and Aliata's paper trail, the case likely never would have amounted to more than another dismissed complaint. The county, in the aftermath, offered Wade a modest reward connected to a state program for information, leading to the conviction of animal cruelty operations, a few $1,000s that would have meant something once back when the truck payment and the roof repair felt like the most urgent problems in his life. He accepted it mostly because refusing outright felt like an unnecessary complication, and used most of it to finally fix the transmission properly and put a new roof over the trailer before winter set in fully. But the money was never, if he was honest with himself, the thing that mattered. What mattered was the quiet that settled over the property in the weeks after, a different kind of quiet than the empty, unfilled silence that had defined Wade's days before Ranger walked out of the tree line. This quiet had weight to it, had company in it. By December, the leg had improved as much as Dr. Anand said it likely ever would, a permanent limp, arthritis that would need managing for the rest of the dog's life, but a mobility that let him move around the property with something close to confidence. The clouded eye hadn't worsened, and might, the vet said, stay stable for years, yet if they were lucky. The coat had filled back in fully, sable and thick against the cold, and the ribs that had been visible that first October morning were long since covered in healthy weight. Wade built a proper dog bed that winter, out in the front room by the wood stove, thick padding, and a worn quilt Ranger claimed within the first hour, though most nights he still ended up on the floor beside Wade's bed by morning, some habits too deep to fully retrain even after everything. There was an evening in mid-December, snow unusual enough for the county that half the town had shut down early in anticipation of it, when Wade sat on the porch despite the cold, a blanket around his shoulders, coffee actually hot this time because he'd remembered to bring it out fresh. Ranger stretched along the boards beside him with his head resting against Wade's leg, and Wade found himself, without any particular reason for the thought to arrive just then, feeling something he hadn't expected to feel again, something he might have called peace if he'd trusted himself to name it accurately. The knee still ached in the cold. The nights still came with their share of restlessness, though less than before, less every month it seemed, like some part of his nervous system had finally found a reason to stand down from a watch it had kept for years. The VA paperwork still sat in its drawer, unresolved in the ways bureaucracy always stayed unresolved. None of the hard things about his life had disappeared. But the shape of the days had changed, had filled in around the edges the way Ranger's coat had filled back in, and Wade understood, sitting there in the cold with his hand resting on the dog's back, that this particular quiet, this particular company, was worth more than any settlement check or reward money the state could have offered him. We did all right, Wade said out loud to the dog, to the snow starting to drift down past the porch light, to nobody in particular and everybody who mattered. We did all right, Ranger. The dog made that low, rolling sound in response, the sound that was his and only his, the sound Wade had come to listen for the way you listen for anything that tells you home is exactly where you're standing, and pressed himself a little closer against Wade's side, and the two of them sat there together while the snow came down, two creatures who had each, in their own way, walked out of something terrible and found, against every reasonable expectation, their way back to each other. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me putting it together, do me a favor and hit that like button before you go. It genuinely helps stories like this one reach more people who need to hear them. Subscribe if you want more true-to-life tales of veterans and the dogs who never really stop serving them. Drop a comment and let me know what part hit you hardest. And if you've got someone in your life who loves a story about loyalty finding its way home, go ahead and share this one with them. Thanks for sitting with this story all the way to the end. We'll see you in the next one.